Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the question and answer video that I do most Sundays. I think you can see Holly back here behind me, and maybe she's going to go do something else now. She's out here exploring. I have been sitting down for these question and answer videos, but it's cold out here this morning, so I'm going to stand. It's just more comfortable standing and moving a bit like I always do. I think I bug people with the amount of moving that I do, but I bugged my teachers in elementary school as well. So here we are. This past week, you will have seen a Japanese maple being contorted video using some wire to bend a Japanese maple like the one that's in the ground out here that I've been asked about since I've been showing that maple off for 4 or 5 years, how I have initially bent the trunk on it. So I started that project on that maple on the porch this week, and then what else was I had a tour of this garden this week. You will probably have seen a color guard yucca go in a container, possibly another container video. I don't know what I'll get edited between now. I'm shooting this on Friday morning, and what else? It's finally cold out here. I've got a cover on the vegetable garden over there overnight for the cool season vegetables, and finally getting this garden to sleep, and happy about that. I really want to get some upper 20s nights on this garden and get everything, you know, kind of put to sleep for the winter, because you really need it to, like a slow, steady decline is the best way for a garden to go to sleep. Because once everything's asleep, the cold really doesn't hurt most things at that point. It's always the risk of it's all still actively growing, and then you get something that's really cold really quickly, where the danger lies. So good. I'm just glad it's getting to sleep. So there we go. So some questions from last week's video. You can ask gardening questions down below this video, and I pick from them each week, and try to pick ones, again, I say this every week, that are kind of relevant to the time the time of the year that we're doing these. One that wasn't from last week's video, but I did see it on another video, was somebody recommending somebody use gypsum on their clay soils to break up their clay. And I've talked about this, I'm sure in a Q&A, and I talked about it in a completely separate video about just gardening myths or something like that. Gypsum's one of those things that's been recommended for, by a lot of garden centers, including the garden center I worked at as a teenager here in Raleigh a long, long time ago. We would recommend gypsum for people to use on their clay soils because it does, in fact, break up clay, or changes how the clay is bound together. But the problem with it is farmers don't even like to use it in situations where farmers use it to leach salt from their fields. So if they have sodic soils, or their soils have become salty over time from fertilizers, or whatever kind of saltwater intrusion maybe, or something like that, they'll use it to actually leach, basically leach the soil. So keep in mind, if you use gypsum, there's some possibility that you're actually going to leach beneficial nutrients for your plants. And so it's one of those things that, yes, it does the thing people are telling you, but you may have a very negative consequence of having done it. So I highly recommend that you don't take any advice from anybody who's telling you to change the chemistry of your soil without that person, being, at a university, or, some sort of recommendation from a soil scientist of some kind. Just don't take those recommendations. Don't start trying to alter your soil without some additional knowledge. And again, it's one of those things that's just gotten passed down, and people just do it. It does, in fact, do the thing they're telling you it does, but you may leach other beneficial nutrients, heavier nutrients like calcium or something like that, out of your soil, and then just have a different problem. So I'm just throwing that out there. Don't take recommendations for people who are telling you to change your soil in some way other than just adding organic material to it: compost, humus, wood chips, hardwood mulch, pine straw, any organic material, sticks, limbs, leaves, doesn't matter. All that stuff's beneficial. Everything else is a risk, potential risk, without knowing more about your soil. Okay, somebody asked about frost versus freezes, because there's people makes a differentiation sometimes between what is a frost and what is versus a freeze. One thing that happens, the sun's coming up on me from the right. I may have to change this angle in a second. The thing with frost versus freezes, you can be above 32 degrees and end up, the air temperature, but end up with ice on windshields in the morning. And so, you get anytime the temperature is predicted around 36 degrees, 37 degrees, you're going to have pockets that are going to super cool in the morning and form ice. And so it's evaporative cooling. When we have evaporation in the air, these cold nights tend to have dry air. And when we have dry air, we get evaporation from any water that's out here that's available. That evaporation can cool the air around it and form ice crystals above, the air temperature being 32 degrees. So obviously you get frost when it's below freezing. This morning, everything out here is frosty, but we can also, again, get frost when it's above 32. The only real reason to differentiate between the two, I think, is in the spring more than in the fall, because going into winter, it's no big deal that I'm getting frost on the older foliage from my plants from this past season. Most of the stuff's going to sleep. Most of it's going to die back to the ground. Most of the older leaves on my plants, or mature leaves, don't typically get hurt by having frost on them. They can sometimes, with the sun hits things that have frost on them, has the potential to cause some damage. I believe that's another one of those kind of overhyped things. But you can get some, I guess, magnification in the ice and actually get a little bit of burn on the leaf from having frost on them. But really, frost becomes an issue in the spring when we have things waking up too early and we have that super tender growth on things. That's where frost can really cause you a problem. And so if you're looking at a forecast and it's going to be 35 degrees, you have the potential to have frost even though it's not going to be below freezing. And that frost can be, in some cases, as damaging or more damaging to have ice crystals on the foliage of the plant than it is to have the temperature below freezing and have no frost in some cases. And so I think it's really more of an issue on the other side of the winter than it is this time of year. I don't worry about frost this time of year at all, because again, most everything out here is either hardened off old foliage or it needed to get cold and go to sleep anyway. So it's no big deal. But in the spring is when I'm super concerned about it. I was especially concerned about it in the nursery business because we could have a 34 or 35 degree night, take all the new growth off of, Loropetalum. I'm going to say Loropetalum. Loropetalum's a great example of a plant that wakes up too early in the spring, and so we're frost sensitive. So basically, at the end of the day, I just considered anything below 36 to be a freeze because it's going to have the same effect regardless. That's in Fahrenheit, obviously. Yes, we are weird in America. Still be on Fahrenheit, but 32. I guess. Anyway, okay. So somebody asked, I talk about conifers growing in cooler weather. So most of the conifers that I have out here in the landscape, and I can look around right here, there's a boulevard cypress over here, got new growth. There's a weeping deodar cedar over here, it's got new growth. It's pretty typical in the fall and in the early spring for these conifers to be growing. They wanted to know if it would be helpful to fertilize them, based on the fact that they were growing. No, I think you just fertilize it when you fertilize. You fertilize, in the late winter, spring, maybe into early summer is about as late as I would want to fertilize, because the plant's doing that with or without you. It doesn't need your additional fertilizer. The other thing is I'm using organic fertilizers here. And so organic fertilizers work based on the life in your soil, breaking them down and making them available for the plants. And so there's soil microbes that allow the organic fertilizer to work are no longer active. they're slowing down rapidly as that soil temperature falls below 65 down to 60 and gets colder and colder. Your soil biology, the beneficial bacteria, beneficial fungi, those things are going to go sleep, and so they're no longer breaking that fertilizer down and making it available. So that's how the system works. The system allows everything just to kind of go to sleep. And then in the springs, it starts to wake back up. It starts breaking those things down and making those nutrients available. Starts bringing your, the mycorrhizal fungi start bringing water or, nutrients from distance to your plants, and everything starts waking back up naturally. So even if you put an organic fertilizer out right now, it would make very little difference because there's nothing out here to actually get it started, and it'll just make your dogs will be happy if you have dogs because they love to eat it. So that's the real reason. Is I use organic fertilizers and they won't work in the winter anyway. So let's see. Somebody has some old tires and bobcat tracks, and they want to use it for edging. I guess, planting, in a tire or whatever. You do you is what I always say. But they said, would it help protect some blueberries to be in that black tire or whatever? But they're in zone 8B. Your blueberries don't need any protection whatsoever. And I would be scared, not scared, but I would be concerned that black tire potentially wakes your if the roots heat up on your blueberries, it could wake them up a little bit early. Blueberries are another one of those plants that are super susceptible to blooming, and then having a frost or freeze damage the open flowers. They tend to get started a little bit too early. So I think in zone 8B, I would want the blueberries to stay asleep as long as possible on the late part of the winter. So I would not want to elevate my blueberries in any kind of black container in the sun. And then have them potentially wake up early, because you'll end up having to cover them if not. But the rest, you use what you want to use in your garden. But I would be cautious in waking up any early flowering thing because the potential is there to damage the actual open flowers. Somebody has some sweet potato tubers and are decorative sweet potato tubers, so not like actual sweet potatoes that they bought to eat. These are like the gold foliage or black foliage sweet potatoes. And they dug them up, and they have the tubers, and wanted to know, one, if they were edible, and number two, if they could keep them for the winter. Yeah, you can absolutely store them. You can put them in like a cardboard box in vermiculite, or potentially peat moss, but vermiculite, perlite, something like that, and store them in a cool, dry place. And so you can absolutely store those decorative sweet potato vines and replant them in the spring without any problem. They're not really edible. They're not particularly good as edible ones, except for there is a new series of those sweet potato vines that are edible, and so that's coming quickly. They're actually already out, and I can't remember the name of them. Oh man, it's Treasure Island. Wow, I just pulled that out. Treasure Island sweet potatoes. So be on the lookout for those. I know that if they're not available where you've been, they're coming for sure. So we're going to see decorative sweet potato vines become edible plants very quickly. The other ones are edible; they're just not good. But that's coming. So we're going to have basically decorative pots with these things, or decorative, and then we'll dig them up in the fall and actually eat them. So that combo is coming, but in the meantime, you can store the ones you have for the winter. Somebody has, they mulched, and then they have burrows in their mulched spaces, and wanted to know maybe if they have voles now. Well, it's possible that you could end up with voles, but probably if it's burrowing, and you can see the burrows, that's more likely moles. And voles do come along and use mole tunnels, or it could be, I guess it could be a groundhog if it was big, it was big tunnels. But if you're just seeing those little low tunnels like we see typically, usually that's moles. The moles do a lot of the tunneling, and then the voles are opportunistic and will come and use those mole tunnels as a way to stay underground and prevent the hawks and birds from seeing them. And then they can do damage. But typically those burrows are not voles. Doesn't mean you don't have voles, doesn't mean you won't get voles. but that's probably not what's causing the burrowing that you're seeing. Okay, somebody asked how much to water evergreen plants in the winter, specifically said Laura Petalum. So now I've said it twice. I don't really water in the winter unless I went into the winter dry. We finally have gotten some rain, and so now I can see the soil out here. I can definitely see the soil's moist. I can see the frost that formed on top of my mulch, and that frost forming on top of my mulch tells me that there's water in the mulch there without even having to check. I know there's water down there, because otherwise where would that frost be able, how would that frost be able to form? So I do almost no watering in the winter here in Raleigh, North Carolina. So if you're obviously in a drier area, that doesn't mean I'd never water. It just means that typically by November, the faucet kind of opens back up for us a bit, and we start to get rain, once a week or twice a week on a pretty regular basis. This is September and October, though. I had to water a lot this year. This is the most watering I've had to do in the fall in years. We just went into the fall very dry, but and that time of year can be dry. But by the time we get into mid-November, where we are now in December, I don't do hardly any watering at all. But if you've planted something new recently, and it was kind of root bound when it went into the ground, I would definitely go and pull the mulch back and put your finger down there, see if it needs any water, and then water it if it does. But I try to do very little. I want the garden to go to sleep. I talked about this earlier in the video here. I want the garden to go to sleep because I like to take a break from it. It gives me an opportunity to go other places and see other things and not have any maintenance to do here. So almost none. Okay. Somebody has a Lakota in zone 6B. They've got it in a protected space, but we're concerned about it going into this winter. Just marginal leafy evergreen plant. So it doesn't matter that this was a Lakota, but if you have a marginal leafy evergreen plant, going into winter, how would you go about protecting it? And one thing is about mulching the roots, making sure that that there's a pretty decent layer of mulch around it. That mulch can be whatever organic material that you want to use, but making sure that the roots are, again, and then I just said about winter watering, it's definitely don't want something to get dry that is marginal. So we want to keep an eye on the watering, but don't overwater them. But that would be a plant that I probably would be more concerned about. But they said it's in a protected space, meaning that there's not a lot of winter wind on it, and wanted to know if they should spray a desiccant spray on it. I talked about that last week, using some sort of pine oil spray on boxwoods. That was in last week's question and answer about spraying them to keep the winter wind from damaging them. If it's in a protected space and you're not going to get winter winds directly on them, you don't have to spray them. I think this is a situation where you're going to cover this plant on nights that are below like 20 degrees. Anything below 20, 22 maybe, I'm going to cover this plant. And in zone 6B, I don't know how many nights you get like that during the winter, but that's probably the nights that I would go out and put a sheet over this plant the first winter. Once it gets a year under it and it's in a protected space, it'll probably be fine in the future. Okay, should I shear my Carolina Sapphire Arizona cypress that's kind of fat? So if you guys have seen those blue Arizona cypress, they're literally everywhere now. The Carolina Sapphire is the most popular one. There's one called Blue Ice that I actually like quite a bit, but for some reason, Carolina Sapphire is the one that is kind of the one that all the nurserymen are growing, and wanted to know if they should shear it since it's growing a little fatter. If it's fatter than it, if you have the space for it, I would probably just leave it alone. I think over time it will. It's still going to end up as a fatter specimen potentially, or a wider specimen, I should say. But it will thin some as it goes up. in that ratio will change some as it gets some height on it. But if you don't have room for it, yeah, I would start shearing the sides on it. Just don't cut the leader, but just you can shear the sides without any problem. I would probably do that in February. It's probably when I would do that. Yeah, if you need to for the space, yes, do it. But it's not, it's not necessary. Okay, somebody asked, what is my favorite Japanese maple? Also asked what Steph's favorite Japanese maple, and she's not here this morning, and I forgot to ask her. So my favorite Japanese maple, actually, there's one over at the Ralston, is that gold bark Japanese maple, Bihu. That is my absolute favorite, Bihou. That is definitely my favorite Japanese maple. And right now, if you went over to the Ralston and looked at it, it's just gold stems on it. It's probably one of the best bark colorations or trunk colorations on any Japanese maple. That one's my favorite. And I really love Orangiola, and they're side by side at the Ralston. The J.C. Ralston emblem is a Japanese maple leaf, if you've ever seen that. And one of the goals over at the Arboretum is you cannot stand anywhere in the Arboretum and not have a Japanese maple in line of sight. So they have a tremendous collection of them right up the road here. But Bihu is definitely my favorite, and just mainly because of winter interest. Just such a beautiful plant. It's beautiful year round, but in the winter it just really shows off. Okay, so somebody asked me, they had the pine trees cut down and then chipped up. And were there any worries with using that pine that they're going to plant? They're going to plant the area much later, and wanted to know if they can just leave that pine chips there. Absolutely, yeah. Oh my gosh, it's going to improve that soil vastly between now and the time you're actually working on that space. So, yeah, that's great. It's great to keep that material. Again, I consult with people sometimes, and they've just had trees removed. And then they let the people take the material with them, and then I'm going, hey, wood chips would really help the space, but the wood chips just left, and they paid someone to do it. So good, yeah, I'm glad you left them there. Don't let the organic material leave your own property. If you can convert it into something for your space to improve your space. Somebody asked about transplanting in Zone 6A. Now or in the early spring. It just completely depends on what it is. Like deciduous shrubs, if you were asking me if you could transplant Rose of Sharon or Forsythia or something that loses its leaves and goes completely dormant, hydrangeas, those kinds of things that are really hardy there, I'd probably do it now as they're going fully dormant. Leafy evergreens or marginal plants, probably I'm going to wait until late winter. So as a rule for you in Zone 6A, I'd probably wait till the other side of winter as the soil's thawed, and just that way I don't have to give you the whole list, But again, those things that really go to sleep and are super, super hardy, those deciduous things that lose their leaves, plants that are tough as nails, you could definitely do now. But again, I'm going to tell you to wait till late winter just so I don't have to give you the whole list of plants, because all of them could be done then before they wake up. So somebody asked me about repotting blueberries in grow bags now. Would they go ahead and do it now? Yeah, they're so cold hardy, I wouldn't worry about it. It goes back to that other question, though, about if those grow bags are black, keep in mind they may, in fact, wake your blueberries up a little bit earlier. But in terms of whether or not you can transplant blueberries, you can transplant blueberries almost any time. They're one of the most cold hardy plants. Perhaps, if I gave you the list, if I was growing 150 different varieties at my old nursery, if I gave you the whole list of things that we did nothing with in the wintertime, and I mean truly nothing. We didn't put them pot to pot. We didn't water them differently. We didn't cover them. We didn't think about them. Blueberries is the whole list. That was the one plant in a container that, I don't know how you kill one in a container in the wintertime. They are just, God, they're tough. So that was the only plant in the nursery. We just, walked by them, and my guys kept going, what do we got to do with these? What do we got? Nothing, literally nothing. They'll be fine. Let's see, what are my thoughts on root washing? So this is a technique of when you buy a plant or tree, or buy something in a container, that you would take it out of the pot and wash all the soil off the roots and stretch all the roots out before you plant them. Obviously, this is the best. I mean, I hate to say this, but obviously, this is the best way to go about planting a container plant in the ground. Would be to wash all that existing soil off and pull the roots out, and then put it in there so that all the roots are going outward, like they probably naturally would have if it was a seed that had just germinated in place. The problem with that is the conditions kind of have to be perfect outside for that, and so I wouldn't want to tell somebody to do that on August 15th, in 98-degree weather. I wouldn't want to tell somebody to do that necessarily on a super, super cold day, and have the roots out and have it sitting on the side. I don't know that it's beneficial enough to take a huge risk. Now, most of these shrubs, I think, with the roots wrapping around them, a few roots die off and they work it out. On something, if I'm planting an oak and I want it to be there for the next 100 years, that might be a candidate. Large shade trees, things that are really long-term invested pieces in a garden, maybe root washing would be the way to go to ensure that they just have the perfect conditions, because they're going to be there the next 100 years or more. But I'm just not going to do that with a butterfly bush. I'm going to break some roots up and put it in the ground and move on. I've never had one, have an issue. So I think that's the only time I would do it. But is it the absolute optimum way to plant a plant? Yes. But again, conditions outside need to be better, because you're exposing those roots to issues. Now the sun is really on my head. I think I'll move. Now I have the blown out shed behind me back there with the sun on it. But yeah, I mean, root washing is probably the optimum way to plant plants. It's just I don't have that kind of patience. Let's see. Somebody has raised beds and the soil has dropped about 6 inches in the beds over time. And that happens, especially if you use a lot of organic material. That tends to be the thing when we put in raised beds. People don't put any native soil into it. They put almost all organic material in it. And then what happens? The organic material breaks down and it settles. She has peonies in the bed, and so she's worried about putting, he or she, I don't know why I said she, may have been, I have no idea. The person has peonies in the bed and is concerned about putting 6 inches of soil back on the top of them, and they probably should be. Peonies don't like to be planted very deep. I mean, about almost at the surface, or maybe 3 inches down is about the most you'd want to put them in. But peonies don't mind being, once they're asleep, and mine are asleep back here at this point, they don't mind if you just put a shovel under them and raise them up and fill the bed. That's probably the strategy I would use. Is I would search around in there. It might be the time you could divide your peonies at the same exact time you're raising them up. So, but peonies are more sensitive than other things would be to burying them in 6 inches of soil. So I would be concerned as well, and I would dig them up, divide them, and plant them back into your newly raised bed. Okay. Somebody has, I talked about anaerobic soils last week, smelly. If the soil smells bad, a lot of times that's bacteria or fungi that are, bad guys instead of good guys, basically. They're getting coffee grounds from their local coffee shop, and it smells really bad. That is probably what it is. It's just anaerobic bacteria, in there. And wanted to know if it was a concern putting it out in the garden. I doubt it. My biggest concern with people telling me they're using coffee grounds and all these other things that people throw out in their gardens is make sure you're spreading that stuff far and wide. So, when you sling it out into your garden, make sure it's going over a big area and you're not concentrating anything in one spot. And so I think if you were just slinging those coffee grounds out in the garden, it's not going to cause you any problems. the good guys in the soil will take care of that real quick. But again, I'm always concerned when people are asking me about throwing those kinds of things in the garden in general, whether they're just concentrating them in one spot. Just spread anything out across the garden and it'll get taken care of. Let's see. Somebody has a Radiance abelia and it's got some green branches in it. I think you can see it's probably blown out a little bit here. My Miss Lemon abelia, and I've got Radiance in the front garden. All the variegated abelia get green stems occasionally, and yes, you need to cut those out as quick as possible and trace it all the way back into the plant and cut it right at where it's originating from. But the green part will grow faster than the variegated part, and it will eventually take over the plant if you don't remove them. All of these variegated abelia were sports, meaning that they are variegated pieces off of green plants. They weren't like, it wasn't like a seedling that came up that was variegated, or this used to be a green plant, and then somebody found a little variegated piece on it, took that cutting, and then what we've seen is maybe that variegated plant gave us a different variegation, and so all the variegated abelia are from green abelia, so they all have that in their DNA, and they will almost all at some point give you a green branch here or there. I've got a variegated trailing gardenia over here. It's the same exact thing. It'll eventually get a green branch in it. Just cut them out quick so that they don't take over the plant very, very quickly. Let's see. Mulched leaves. Okay, so I've talked about not burying hardwood mulch and wood chips deep in the ground, or you can possibly create anaerobic conditions in the soil, because that chunky stuff needs air and to break down, and you deny it air by sinking it deeper in the soil. So I always tell people, pull the hardwood mulch way back before you start digging holes, and then plant your plant, and then bring your mulch back, so a lot of that stuff's not falling into the hole, because it does struggle to break down. These folks have a lot of leaves, and they want to know if it's okay to have the leaves over the mulch because they're concerned they're burying the mulch. That's not really burying the mulch. When we're talking about burying the mulch, I'm talking about down in the actual soil. The leaves breathe perfectly fine, so they'll let plenty of air through for your hardwood mulch to break down. So not a concern at all, and that's the way the woods are working. You know, you think about all year long they've been dropping sticks and pine cones and seeds and all kinds of stuff, and now they're dropping their leaves on top of it. It's not causing any problem out there at all. It's just when you dig a hole and bury that stuff 8, 10, 12, 15 inches deep that it denies it air. Okay, so a couple more here before we wrap this up. I think it's about 20 this week. Protecting sky pencil hollies in a zone 5 winter. So this is another one you could spray with an anti-desiccant or wrap them in burlap. I've seen people wrapping them in burlap. That's probably the best. I don't know where Holly is. Hey, come here, girl. Come here. I didn't know where you were. I didn't even know where you were. She's over by the vegetable garden here. So you can wrap them in burlap. This is one of those plants I don't understand. I don't know if they're in 5A or zone 5A or 5B, but I've always questioned. And somebody can comment down below. Do you have a sky pencil holly in zone 5 that's doing well? Because I see them frequently listed for zone 5 to 9. They probably don't even do that great in zone 9, honestly. But I've always wondered, are there sky pencil hollies that look great in zone 5? And are you in zone 5A or 5B? Because I wonder if they actually are cold hardy up there. Because I would have never thought Japanese hollies would have survived a real zone 5 winter. But maybe I'm wrong. And if you are, do you have them there? Because the tag said zone 5. Yeah, you can wrap them in burlap during the worst of the winter with the winds. You could spray them with an anti-desiccant spray like we talked about earlier. And then, okay, so the last thing wasn't a question. It was just, I talked about last week going out on the road and doing some meetups next year. And I got great suggestions from you guys for garden centers in your area. So I will go back through that list as we're heading out. And I'm going to have one I think I'm going to have one in Raleigh sooner than later. So I'll let the folks in the Triangle area know that in the next few weeks. And so, again, you can ask gardening questions down below this video, and I will pick from those next week. Thanks for watching.